Welcome back to another episode of the H3X podcast, where we discuss the head, heart, and hands of the multiplying church and her leaders. I'm Dave Miller, and my co-host Mark Goering is here. Today I'm out on the family farm. Mark, as always, yeah, Covo life is interesting sometimes. This go round is not necessarily Covo life as much as family life, where I'm here helping my dad on the farm where I grew up because life, events, circumstances, what we call the whirlwind happens. And every now and then, you don't get to control your time. Your time kind of controls you. And so here we are in the middle of all of it. And it's been a good season. It's 110 degrees in Oklahoma. Life happens.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like a lot of people when they do podcasts, they do this like recording in a burst and then they release them from their studio and have it all scheduled out. And that is a great way to do it. But you know what? Our way of doing it is definitely in the process, in the field. It has its pros and cons, but its pro is that you get to just see and experience what it looks like to do the stuff as we do it. So I'm glad you're at the farm today, Dave. It's great.
Well, it's funny, Mark. Occasionally we'll have a podcast that really connects with people, and we'll get a handful of messages or whatever, and we know when one lands. But we also know that sometimes a podcast doesn't necessarily land for 3, 4, 5 months, maybe even a year, and then
Yeah.
somehow it will loop back around. And here's been my experience: is what we're talking about is literally coming out of what we're learning as we're going. So it's like a conversation of the exact things that we're going through. And my experience has been it's not the right timing for every moment, for every person. But if anybody is trying to move through a co-vocational life from a movement based way of doing ministry, where they're trying to multiply disciples and multiply churches out of the ordinary of life, right where you are, like when we say live, work, and play, that the things that we talk about, eventually someone's going to cross that path, because it just seems to me
Right.
that the growth path, the timeline, like the pathway that we're living and walking and we're trying to articulate is really us just in hindsight saying, here's the experiences that we have. Here's the experiences we're seeing repeating. And here's the ones that we've seen so much that we know that if you try to take this journey, you're going to walk this part of the pathway. And we just want to be here to say, hey, here's how we failed, so you don't have to. But there's like a connection point that happens when you hear it.
Yes.
Like you hear the stories, you hear what we're going through, you hear what we're talking about, just as we live through ordinary life. There's a moment in which you go, hey, that's me. Have you ever experienced that? Is that something that's common for you?
Yeah, that is definitely something that's common for me, that I both have that experience, and then as I talk with guys, I see that um we one of the things that's just the reality, the feature of how we do this is we are trying to really just embody and live it out, not be talking heads that just talk about topics, but actually live this stuff out. And the result of that is that we tend to just uh, almost have this, like, to use your language that you've used, Dave, like this gravitational pull, and then we just begin to find and connect with people. It's like, yeah, that's me, and that's what I'm called to do as well. 100%.
So, with that in mind, I think you and I kind of stumbled onto some things just in a matter of conversation, and you brought up this idea of discovering who you are, just kind of randomly in a thought, and I go, Mark, I want to talk about that. I want to unpack that idea a little bit, because I really think that there's two ways. There's more than this, but there's two ways that we want to talk about who you're going to discover that want to multiply churches and multiply disciples and want to do it alongside of you, even if you're not coming from the same perspective that you and I talk about on this H3X podcast. Our goal
Right.
is not to say be like us in every respect. Our goal is to say, hey, here's some common things that we're running into. And potency, for me, is language that I use to describe. One of the best ways I know how to help somebody else is not to become what they are, but to be who I am, to live out the calling that I have the best that I possibly can, and then say, hey, here's my experiences from my segment, my perspective, my passion. And there'll be some commonalities on what we're doing, but there's also going to be things that don't cross pollinate. Right. There's going to be some things that just don't really cut across the seam because for whatever reason, somebody's going to look at your life and they're going to go, I'm nothing like that. But occasionally, and oftentimes, if you do what you love and you're passionate about it, then the people who are not able to really figure out what it is that they're really wanting to do may see what you do and then go, that's what I've been looking for, that discovery moment. I'd love for you to unpack a little bit on just how you've seen that discovery moment happen, not just for what we're doing, but
Yeah.
just in general, how the way you've seen it facilitate other people stepping into what God's called them to.
Yeah, hopefully I can put some words to that offhand, comment there, but, yeah, I think years ago, Dave. So we're titling this podcast episode "How Do People Discover Their Leaders," which is a broad topic, right? But years ago, I'll just share from my own personal experience. I was leading as a vocational leader within the Vineyard Church, and that's relevant to this conversation because as we were talking about what it means to be a leader within that movement, and Vineyard would describe itself as a movement. As we talked about that, one of the pieces of language that we kept using was, "This is not something that you join; it's something that you discover that you are." And that language was this idea of this is not we're not trying to recruit people to this thing. We are trying to live out and embody a certain DNA. And I think most different denominations and movements would say we aspire to do what we see in the word. The Vineyard was no different, is no different, and would say, hey, we want to live out what we see Jesus doing. And those that are going to begin to discover these same values, this same way of approaching it, and even a process of growing into leadership, they're going to join in that sense. They're going to discover that they are and become a part of it in that sense. And so that language at the time really resonated because I began to discover, yeah, as I get around these other leaders, as I get around people who are a part of this, this resonates. This is what I'm called to do. And at the core of that, for that experience in being involved in the vineyard for that season, it was these are people that are going after doing what Jesus did, doing it the way that Jesus did it, living it out as a lifestyle, calling other people to do this alongside of them, experience discipleship shoulder to shoulder. There were some other things that now I do a little bit differently in my understanding of that. But the point was, this was something that we discovered that we were and then became a part of through that. And so that idea really took root then, and it stuck with me that in this process of how do people discover that they're leaders, that can happen as leaders emerge out of the harvest or emerge out of training that are a part of a group or a tribe, like we are investing in, Dave. And it can also happen as we begin to connect with others, and they begin to say, "Wow, those values, that process that you guys are engaging in, and how you're going from lost to leader." And your emphasis within that resonates. That's what God is doing in my life as well. And so there's both of those sides of that can emerge, and then it can also be this process of just self-identifying everything that you're doing, the values, the way you're going about it, it matches what God has been speaking to me.
Whenever you talk about that, it actually reminds me a lot of the way Paul describes um, being able to identify and to see who's going to be leadership in terms of elders. Whenever he's saying to Timothy, hey, while you're at Ephesus, we need to see more elders that are raised up. And here's the things you ought to be looking for. A lot of argument happens about, the gender specifics, men and women. A lot of things will happen where people will go, able to teach is one of them, but then what about all the character pieces, right? And you have all these discussions where everybody talks about what does a character look like? What does a teaching ability look like? What's the gender? Okay, setting all those things aside, we get so wrapped up in all those pieces that one of the things that I very rarely ever hear mentioned is the first qualification. The first thing that Paul says that Timothy should be looking for, and he says, if a man aspires to the office of
Mm,
overseer. That
yes.
aspiring piece is really what I wanted to bring up. Apart from all the other discussions, the character and all those things, they are, I mean, obviously really, really important. But we forget the fact that Paul says, no, they have to want it. They gotta want the leadership. You can't like, we can't just go to somebody and go, "You should lead," and then all of a sudden they just go, "I do that," because 'cause there's got to be a point at which, and I think we're using the same language here, they've gotta discover that this is something that they wanna do, right? So what's been some of your experience in terms of, even in New York recently or even in past history, some of your own experience of how the disciple process and clarity with the lost to leader pathway and knowing what it is you're trying to move people towards has been helpful in allowing someone to discover that they really do want to lead here. Maybe it might be even from your own personal experience, your own testimony of your leadership that grew in the vineyard movement and then beyond that. But however you want to describe that, I'd be really interested in your thoughts on how do you get to the place to where someone goes, no, I want to aspire to that. I've discovered that I want to lead here.
I think at the center of all of this conversation, how do people discover that they're leaders in a part of a tribe that is the right fit, going in the right direction? Is it comes down to alignment. It comes down to lived values. And I remember in that story years ago, as I was talking with some of these other leaders about you don't become or join this movement, you discover that you are. We talked about this idea that we can get on a church website and you can go to the about page or the what we believe, the values page, and you can read some amazing vision casts and description of what this church believes and what they're all about. And then you go and you join the small groups, you go to the Sunday morning gathering, and you walk in the door and you're like, did I walk into the right church? Is this the
Right.
one that's on the website, right? And so you probably get where I'm going with this, Dave, because it's like we write about one thing and then we can live out something else. We are aspiring towards this thing, and I think at the end of the day, that's why we use this word values. And so I think people can sometimes write out values on a website and then leaders not live them out. And so at the core of everything that we're talking about, how do leaders discover that they're leaders and that this is the right tribe or thing to be a part of? Is they're looking at not just what's written on a website, not just what's communicated in a vision cast, but values comes down to time, money, and energy. And you can actually discover somebody's values not by what comes out of their mouth only, that's a starting place, but by where do they invest their resources? Where does their time go, their money go, their energy go? And so we're looking for, I think all of us, we're looking for leaders to follow. And we want to follow leaders that live out what they call people to. We want to follow leaders that their time matches up with the vision that they're sharing with others. Their money, it's backing up. They're actually through the way that they're spending the money, through the way that they're saving their money, through the way that they're thinking about their money, it matches up with what they're saying. And then their energy, where are they putting their energy? Who are they investing their energy into? All of that tells us something about what they value. And so I think at the center of this conversation, Dave, of how do we think about this idea of leaders discovering that they're leaders? It really comes down to values that match what is communicated.
So you and I are planning another immersion opportunity, both in Oklahoma City and New York, coming up in the fall for Oklahoma City, coming up
Right.
in the spring for New York. Um, unpack why being shoulder to shoulder in the environment of around what people are doing is necessary as compared to an about page. or a list of values? Why is it that the actual, like, on the ground, ordinary walking with beside is necessary for people to really discover what they want to become?
So the other phrase that you and I use this, Dave, I've heard different people use this, but is so much of the kingdom is caught, not taught. And I think that's what comes down to when we talk about doing events, which is an event like an immersion, as opposed to something that's more of like a webinar, which we do these, we do labs online. Those things have value as well, right? But something like an immersion in person, it causes those values, how we spend our time, our money, and our energy, to be caught, not taught. It also allows us to discover who has the same values, because to get in person, it costs everybody who's involved time, money, energy. Even the home team that's hosting it, it's going to cost them time, money, and energy. And just by the process of doing something that's not just virtual but in person, just by that nature of it, who is going to value it enough to prioritize it, carve out time for it, spend money to be there? All of that, uh, just by itself, is going to get the people in the room that are serious about it with other people that are serious about it. And that means it's going to be less people oftentimes, but it also means that it's going to be a lot higher quality of the interaction, of the learning together through the doing of it. And then it means on the other side of it, an increased experience of tribe is going to form. And this is, we've used this language. We haven't talked about it in a while, Dave, but this language of tribe. And I think at the end of the day, when we talk about this idea of leaders discovering who they are and what it means to contribute, because that's another word that we use a lot, it's about discovering and then locking arms with like-minded leaders in tribe. And something like an in-person immersion, in so many ways, it causes those values to come to the surface and for you to lock arms with others who have the same values.
So, kind of one of your most important contributions in kingdom conversation, especially multiplying disciples of churches, is really your just understanding of the book of Mark, especially the first few chapters of Jesus's ministry, um, up until he's moving on to Jerusalem. When you look at the life of Jesus, how do you see that Jesus allows people to discover whether or not they want to lead within the movement of the kingdom and the new creation that he's getting started?
We oftentimes use this language, Dave, of allowing others to find us, to discover us. When we do trainings online or when we do this immersion, we want to be found by those that are ready to take those steps. And I think Jesus did that. Jesus, um, he not only did the work as he entered onto the scene in Galilee, but he was trying to be found by the guys that would have the right DNA to continue things forward. And so that is maybe the big question here, is how do you be found by those type of guys? And for Jesus, it involved starting with doing the stuff he was looking for. So he was going to go out. He's saying, like, who has the qualities, the character qualities, the skills, who has uh who has what it takes to count the cost to make this the priority in their life. And so, how do you find that type of person? You go and you do it. So, Jesus went out, he began to go and started with his own relationship network. He's sharing with them. He begins to go out and share the gospel, call people to repent, believe. He's praying for the sick. He's doing the stuff that he's looking for. And then, as he does that stuff, there are these guys that begin to see him, and they have multiple touch points over and over with Jesus where he's saying, "Hey, come join me, come follow me." And eventually they do. And so in this process of Jesus saying, identifying who is going to be found by him and join him, there's this invitation that he's extending. There's this model that he's doing. And then once they begin to say, "Yeah, I think this might be me," it's time with him. So that idea of caught, not taught. So Jesus beginning to just invite them into time with him, and that not being a classroom setting where he sets up shop in Capernaum, where he gets started and says, "Hey, everybody, here's what my kingdom effort, my movement is going to look like." He doesn't sit down and do a classroom. He continues to embody and do the stuff. And by that, he finds out who has these same values. Again, time, money, energy, that they want to rearrange that around what Jesus is inviting them into. And then as they sacrifice a few chapters in, he says it actually, you begin to find this moment where the crowds are starting to grow. They're starting to come more and more. And instead of leaning into the crowds and Jesus setting up that opportunity to share and to preach, he actually goes up on the mountaintop, he retreats, and he calls to himself those that he wants. In other words, those that have sacrificed around those values. And he says, "Hey, these guys are going to be the leaders within this emerging movement."
You just articulated a very risky proposition, my friend. Like, think about it for a second. And I really want you to respond to this because I think your experience in New York is super helpful for anybody who listens to this because I think every person is going to land here in this season of life if they move this direction, if they listen to what you're saying. What you just said was is that Jesus truly believed in what he was doing and who he was enough to go do the work and to live out the identity that he believed to be true on his own, and then waited for people to recognize the truth of it instead of, and here's the risky proposition, what if someone never gathers around me to validate what I'm doing? That's
Yeah.
not how our culture works, Mark. Our culture works where you come up with a good idea and then your job is to go convince people to join you in it. And then when you get enough people to join you in it, then you say, look, all these people validated me. Followers do it, views do it, clicks do it. All of those things validate whether or not what you say is true. And you just said the exact opposite, that Jesus is upending that entire way of validating whether or not something is legitimate. I mean, do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So, in your experience, you go to New York, you land, and you say, I want to do disciple making in this way. I'm pretty sure more than one person, whether Christian or not, has said, no, thank you. You have no credibility because you don't have the following yet. What do you do with that?
Uh, Yeah, you're right, Dave. I think that is definitely a countercultural idea, and I don't think that we're alone in taking steps like that. I mean, I think Paul, as you read through books and chapters like Second Corinthians, and as you get towards Second Corinthians 10, Paul called himself like scum. People looked at him, looked at what he was doing, and completely just dismissed what he was doing. And I have taken comfort from reading Second Corinthians, especially in the way that this man trying to follow the model of Jesus planted. He staked out a spot. He said, "This is what I'm going to be doing. To the best of my understanding, this is how I'm going to live out what I see from what Jesus has entrusted to me." And I think that is a very challenging thing to call people to and to live out. But it's also necessary, especially in we started this podcast today, Dave, and you talked about, hey, you're out on the farm today and the whirlwind happens. The whirlwind is real. And for all of us, as we talk about this on Substack today and you listen to this later, your whirlwind is different than my whirlwind, but it's similar in that it there's constantly things that are challenging and distracting, and even the enemy lying to us that's trying to get us off track from the main thing. And so that's a we've got podcast episodes on that, Dave, on the topic of the whirlwind. But that's really what we're beginning to scratch at here is if we feel clear conviction around some values and some things that we see Jesus doing, and we read about other leaders and echoes of Jesus throughout history. Our job is to go, I use this analogy all the time, to go take a run until people begin to join us on either side of us and we start a running club that way. And it's not an easy thing to do, but it is the model of Jesus.
I I'm gonna go a little off topic to something that doesn't even come close to measuring up to the example of Jesus. I just finished up. I like to read biographies. I just finished up a biography of Steve Jobs in exile. I do not recommend Steve Jobs as our moral example
Right.
in any form or fashion. But there is something about Steve Jobs, at least in the American culture, you can't bypass the guy. I mean, you and I both right now are doing what we're doing because of something that Steve Jobs built in the 90s. Right. The only reason that you and I are even able on a Substack and people are on Substack watching what we're doing and talking about what we're doing is we're still literally functioning off of code that was written by Steve Jobs and his team in the 90s whenever he had been kicked out of Apple the first time before he went back to Apple the second time. And the reason I bring this all up is to say, um, everybody understands that he was a genius, regardless of how he got to where he got and his personality and all of his ups and downs, ins and outs. Leave that all behind. During the 90s, when he was spending tens of millions of his own money and hundreds of millions of other money, Ross
Right.
Perot's money, Cannon's money, to develop a system that was so far ahead of its time that he couldn't sell it because nobody wanted to pay the $10,000 in 1994 for a box that was going to become the foundation of the iPhone's operating system. That's how far ahead he was.
Yeah.
He was building what he wanted the iPhone to become in the 90s, but the technology didn't exist to actually bring about what he was developing just yet. But yet, he had a group of people who quit all of their jobs in really money-making companies, making six-figure salaries to make less than six figures in the 1990s and late '80s to develop an idea and a vision because they believed in it. And they followed this guy literally into oblivion,
Yeah.
developed something that was 10 years ahead of its time. He lost a lot of people on the way. And here's the reason I bring it up. Through set of circumstances, he became very famous and got to do what he wanted to do. But there were so many times where he almost faded into oblivion and just the right people at the right time in the right places all came together and it
Right.
worked. Here's the reason I bring this up. I listened to the biography of Steve Jobs in exile and the story of him between his Apple stints. And I see the way that he basically almost failed to the point to where he gave away $115 million and almost never got it back and became a forgotten bygone of history that no one would have ever talked about.
Yeah.
Every single time we go into what you just said, you're taking a risk, and that risk may not cost $115 million of our own money to try to get it off the ground. But the only people we ever hear about are the Steve Jobs and Elon Musks who made it,
Yeah.
right? How
Yeah.
many people spent that much of their money and it didn't work out for them? And so nobody wrote their biographies and no one cares. And
Right.
that's the point I wanted to bring up right now is I think one of the biggest barriers to this discovery, to this aspiring, is that there are a lot of leaders there. I'm going to talk a little bit into the camera here a little bit, or to the ones that are in the microphone, the ones who are listening. Maybe because I'm in a motivational mood. I don't know. But there are a lot of people, Mark, who are listening to this who are on the barrier. They're on that little edge of the cliff who are deciding, do I want to take the risk to really lead in what I really believe in? And
Yeah.
the reason that they haven't stepped off that just yet is because they understand fundamentally, even if they can't articulate it, that if I do this, that there's a good chance that I may not make it, I'm going to fail, and I might be forgotten. And my
Right.
answer to them is whenever it comes to multiplying disciples in churches, in our world, making the ordinary live, work, and play, and saying we are intentionally going to lean into the ordinary, to the co-vocational life for the purpose of the kingdom, almost guarantees in our culture that you're going to be forgotten. Your likes are going to go down, your views are going to go down, your people coming and flocking to you and finding you and saying, "Tell me more about what you believe." It's
Yeah.
almost a guarantee that they're gonna walk away because 'cause they're gonna say, "You're crazy," because it's so anti-cultural of what we're doing. But I still think that the risk is worth taking. I wanna give you an opportunity to say, why do you still take the risk, Mark? Why is it that you are still doing it, and why did you find what you believe to be true and took the risk and aspired to say, "Yeah, I wanna lead in this"?
So, Dave, we use a this language of WIG take, WIG take. What's it going to take, right? And when we think about what Jesus modeled for us, what your story of Steve Jobs is a we got a little bit in there as the metaphor. It's not Jesus, but it's a metaphor.
No.
Yeah.
It's the
So
metaphor of taking a risk and it paying off.
yeah, but we'll talk from Steve back to Jesus. So Steve had to start with what's it going to take, and so he started with an end vision of I don't know if he even had in his mind the iPhone in a formed way at that point, but he had in his mind how some sort of technology would begin to uh, use biblical language like yeast begin to leaven and impact the culture and change it in such a way that it could be like a delivery system to ship culture around the world. He had that in his mind. And he had to start from what's it going to take and go all the way back to, all right, then if that's what it's going to take to have that kind of, if that's the end goal, that's what it's going to take is this process, this journey, it could take years. We're going to start back here and I'm going to build a team that will live out and will emphasize and focus on all of the different pieces that it's going to take to get to there. We're going to have these set of values because we're going to get to this end goal. And he started from that place and began to live that out with his team and build piece by piece towards that. And so this is why I think it's worth it because Jesus is worth it. And Jesus models this in his own life that he understood what it was going to take to serve the Father's vision for every people and every place to see multiplying disciples. And so, all the way back to the beginning, you be fruitful, multiply, subdue the earth. And what that then led to, Dave, as we talk about in co-vocational, is many people tilling the ground as farmers, taking care of their animals. And then as things begin to develop, we've got people in so many parts of our society and culture now. People that work in shops, people that are coaches on teams, people that run a nail salon or they work at Walmart, or we could go on and on. You're out on a farm today. We can go on and on with all the different sectors of society, right? And if we're going to talk about what's it going to take to see the Great Commission happen, and that's what our laser focus is on, we want to see Jesus, who gave all authority to us, see disciples happen in every people in every place, which is what he wants, then that means that we've got to go back, like Steve, all the way back to say, all right, what's it going to take to get to that end? And all these people in all these different parts of our society who work a job, who are there 9 to 5 on a normal, ordinary day, most of them who are far from God are not going to be walking into the doors of a church building. They're not going to be experiencing the gospel unless people work alongside of them, people who share their hobby, people that live in their building begin to talk with them. And so, if we're going to get to that point, Dave, where the gospel is beginning to permeate and saturate all these pockets of every people in every place where we say where people live, work, and play, then we've got to call people to that. And if we're going to follow the model of Jesus, he started by going out and doing it so that he could begin to find with that gravitational pull who else is going to also count the cost, their values, their time, their money, their energy, and begin to join me in doing that as well. And so I think it's worth it because, like Steve, who's a poor metaphor, but we'll use him today to point towards Jesus, who is our goal, right? we're going to backtrack all the way back to what's it going to take, and we're going to live it out and begin to build the tribe of other people who begin to discover, yep, that's me too, and count the cost to dig in and do the stuff, because then, like yeast, man, it's going to begin to just multiply and affect and vision cast at people in ways that we may not even know. And over time, that begins to, like yeast, saturate the culture. And I guess that's where I would land on this, Dave, that in that metaphor that Jesus gives us, that the kingdom grows like yeast, it grows like a seed falling to the ground and dying. You don't get the credit. You don't even get to see the extent or how that process happens. And I think that's part of what helps me personally to count the cost and go and do it, is to realize that the way that Jesus talks about the kingdom coming there, his promise in that is that it won't be in an organizational way that I get to oversee and see necessarily. What it will be is a process of trusting God, that if I will be like yeast and I will live it out, he will do the work of leavening the whole lump in ways that I have no idea that it even happened.
I will say this too, Mark. I have experienced that if I stop doing what I'm doing to go and to try to convince somebody else to do it,
Yeah.
what ends up happening is that neither I do it and they don't do it and nothing gets done. And so I think one of the things that I love about this, about that people discover that they're going to be leaders, is that they discover they're going to be leaders because they see and understand your model and your vision, and they recognize that's what they want. And they can't see it, they can't understand it unless you are putting forth something they can see and understand,
Yep.
right? And so it's risky, but I do think that we're talking about something that is super fundamental to actually multiplying disciples and churches. To see the head, heart, and hands of the multiplying church and our leaders happen, you have to take the risk to become somebody who is able to be found, right? And that means you've got to do the work, and then you've got to open up your home and you've got to open up your work to a life that lets people see into and decide whether or not what you're doing is something that they want to do with you. And I think the two big barriers to that is one is that we stop doing the work to convince other people to do it. That doesn't work. In our
Yeah.
experience, that does not work, right? The second thing is that you close yourself off and you get convictional and you go, well, I'm the only one who's going to do it anyway. And then you get this, you almost get this like um,
Yeah.
identity, that your identity is that I'm the faithful one and everybody else is not. And then you close yourself off because you want to make sure that you stay the true faithful one that everybody gets to see is different.
Sure.
And you got to have both of them where you're going, I want to do the work, but I want to open up my life in such a way that other people can come in. And the risk of both of those things is one, am I going to be forgotten because I just bury my head down in and I do the work? And two, if I open my life up to it, the risk is that people are going to tell me that I'm wrong and they're going to question me or mock me. Well,
Yeah.
here's the thing, Mark. Both are going to happen.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? But I think that the look of and the model of Jesus that you've laid out for us shows us that Jesus truly understood who he was, and he truly opened up his life for other people to do it with him. And the illustration of Steve Jobs brings something in that I think is really important,
Hmm.
and that is timing is everything. Timing is everything. And sometimes your potency is going to be the right timing for the right person. They're going to see it, they're going to understand it, and they're going to say, I'm all in. Teach me how to do this. Let's run. And it is the most joy you will have when someone says, man, show it to me. And then you get to make a disciple. You get to multiply a disciple. You get to multiply a church. You get to raise up a leader from lost to leader. And you see them take off and become somebody shoulder to shoulder with you. And you see a co laborer. There's nothing greater on the planet than that. Like, that's why we do what we do. It's a lot of fun. But if the timing's not wrong, you're going to have somebody who disregards you, who mocks you, or you may even have somebody who comes against you and starts trying to stop you in what you're doing. And those become some of the most difficult relationships that you have. And I think we just got to realize that's just part of the process. That's the risk you take. That's the way that it works. And I don't know how to articulate it, but to say, not only do you discover that you're going to be a leader, but you have to be a discoverable leader at the same time,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So land the plane for us. Final thoughts, especially from your experience. How important is this to developing leaders, and how important is it to keep this mindset and this perspective so that you don't become closed off or you don't quit?
There's different phases of our leadership journey, Dave, and early on, as those that feel like they see some of these examples in Jesus, the disciples, the New Testament, or they read John Wesley, they read other leaders, and they say, "I want to do that." Our job is to join what's happening and get to work and serve. And so, I just want to make sure we hit on that in this podcast. That how do leaders begin to discover? You've got to go get to work. And so, as we go get to work and we begin to engage those around our own oikos, those around us. We're sharing the gospel, we're making disciples. That's going to allow us to be discoverable. So we've got to begin to do the stuff, and we've got to, as we do that, um, we're going to, our fruit is going to speak for us. And so I think that's the biggest piece of becoming discoverable. We've got to continue to do the work and allow our fruit to speak for us. And then on the other hand, we've got to continue to keep our head down, and at some point in the process lock in on, like, and I want to bring in Nehemiah here. Nehemiah is this amazing example of a leader that God called him and trusted him with a job to do, and he went and he started to lock in on that job. And then what happens around chapter 3 or so, 2 and 3 in the book of Nehemiah? Men like Sanballat, he comes along and he begins to just say, "Hey, come down, can we talk about this?" And becomes a distraction to Nehemiah in the work. And his job was to lock in and just say, "This is what I'm doing. And those that are want to contribute towards this work, come and get shoulder to shoulder and let's do it." But he was not going to be distracted at that point. And so I think part of our job is to recognize where we are in that journey, is to say, am I early on? My job is to serve and to get in and join what God is doing and serve. And that allows me to be found by leaders that are a step or two ahead, and they can serve me and pass off what God is doing. And if God has got me to this point where He's really clearly got me locked in on a contribution, then my job is to lock in and not become distracted. And maybe God could do what He did through Nehemiah, through Jesus, as He did the same thing.
Man, I'm really glad you had that offhanded comment, um, because I just think occasionally you and I will get into things that are not quite as practical, but really come down to the core heart of who we are as leaders.
Yeah.
And when we discuss the head, heart, and hands of multiplying church and our leaders, I think this is one of the most important pieces of the heart, is how to stick it out and to understand the season of leadership that you're in and be okay with that and just be who you are to the best of your ability. In that season that you're in. Don't get in a hurry, but also don't go too slow. And it takes a lot of wisdom to do exactly what you just said. But if you guys are listening to this podcast, you're or maybe watching this podcast later on, uh, hit 30 seconds back a couple of times, maybe 3 times, and listen to what Mark just said again, because I think it's really important to understand where you are seasonally as a leader, so that you don't try to behave in a season that you're not in, because that's probably one of the most frustrating pieces. And to understand where you are in that season will help you to discover exactly what it is you need to be doing and contribute the way that you should. So, any last thoughts, follow ups, anything you need our listeners or watchers to know before we hop on next week?
Thanks for teeing this up, Dave. I think this has been important because we do talk about head, heart, and hands. This has been a good one towards that. And we talk about head, heart, and hands, everybody, because we think this is what it takes to see tribe happen. And we would love to invite you to join in rhythms that we have as tribe. We have labs once a month. You'll see that in the description below this, that you can join our next lab that's coming up, which is some really basic tools on how to get started in making and multiplying disciples that everybody should know. And then also, tribe happens for us in a WhatsApp group. And so there's a link below as well that you can click to join us in the WhatsApp, and we'll hope to see you on there.
Cool. We'll see y'all next time.
See you guys.